Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. We want to welcome our participants today, representing 19 different countries, and for this special presentation. I want to welcome you. My name is Sherwin Pomerantz. I want to welcome you to this presentation. This is the third of our series, actually 6 series of lectures, dialogues, observations by members of our IBG Global Group. IBG Global has 21 members in world capitals across the globe. We cover, we have representatives in close to 60 locations, and we cover well over 100 markets worldwide. We're an organization that's been in business a little bit over 15 years. We're involved heavily in assisting companies in their export promotion work, in market studies, in missions, in accessing markets around the world, and we're here basically to serve you. This presentation tonight, which is a special presentation in our 6-part series, is not so much a dialogue between members of our group, which is what we've done up until now, and we'll continue to do 2 weeks from now again, but rather a presentation on a specific issue related to the challenge of changing supply lines out of China. So I'm going to let Dennis Unkovic, who's on the screen with us today, as well as David, make the introductions of himself and his partner. I just want to express our thanks to both of them for taking the time today to be with us and to sharing their knowledge, actually their in-depth knowledge of the topic that we're going to be presenting today. So with that brief introduction, I'll be back to you at the end. If you have questions, if you have comments, feel free to use the chat box, feel free to use Q&A, and we will monitor those as we go through the hour and raise them with our speakers at the end. So Dennis, the microphone is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone on the phone. My name is Dennis Unkovic. I'd like to introduce the two of us in a minute, but I'd like to say that 100 years from now, if anybody watches this video, they'll be looking at me and wondering what this thing is around my neck. This is a necktie. I'm probably the last person in America to be wearing a necktie today, so I'll be readily identifiable. My grandfather was a political refugee who came to America at age 18 when there used to be an Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was a political refugee and essentially was threatened with death, which is why he came to America. So I'm a proud American, a second generation born here. And my grandfather used to tell me when I was a young boy, look, you must wear a tie, you must look like gentlemen, you must look good. So here I am 60 some years later, still wearing the tie in honor of my grandfather. Seriously, you've heard some things about America today, that immigrants are no longer welcome. That is absolutely not true. David Iwinski, who he can tell you his own background in a minute. We're very, very proud to be Americans, but we recognize and are very, very much favoring the important role that immigrants have played and will play in America's future. Now, my name is Dennis Unkovic. I'm a lawyer. That probably is enough to make you turn off your machines at this point saying I don't want to hear a lawyer, but I'm not going to try to be legal today. I've been going to China since 1985. I've been there about 70 times. I've published 2 books. Actually, I've published more than that, but 2 of my most recent books are directed toward the Chinese about how to invest in the United States. And the most recent one, Asia Ascending, was published in 2018, talking about what Asia means. These two books will give, and we're not going to talk about them anymore, but will provide us with background about what is going on, particularly in China today. I'll go into that in a minute. But before I do, I'd like to introduce the other guy on the screen who you'll probably see right below me. His name is David Iwinski. Although his picture shows a tie here, David, I've never seen him in a tie except in that picture. But David and I have known each other for more than 30 years. David first started working with Daimler-Benz, doing major construction projects around the world. Those of you who've been to Frankfurt have seen the Frankfurt airport, the people mover between the terminals, David did that. If you've been on the subways in Rome, David worked there. And if you've been in Singapore and Kuala Lumpur, their airports there, that's what David did. Following that, he worked for a company called Respironics. Ironically, since we're in the middle of the pandemic, I think we're still in the middle of it, David worked for a respiratory company, which was later bought by Philips. In that capacity, he lived and worked in China for 6 years running a factory that we'll talk about more later. Following that, he set up a medical transcription company with a couple of thousand employees in India. Now he's the president of his own consulting group. David and I have known each other for 30 years. Politically, we rarely agree, but on business, we almost always agree. But what we're going to do in the next hour is give you what I think is going to be a conversation rather than a presentation. It changes all the time because circumstances are going to change. Now, I'm going to turn it over to David, but basically we've divided our presentation into 3 parts. You know, what has happened in China, which we can talk to from direct experience. We're going to talk about how bad it is, then we're going to talk about what we can do about it. Now, David, give us a little more view about what you think we're going to try to cover in the next hour.
Sure. Thank you very much, Dennis, for that introduction. And you're correct. Actually, this particular picture, I was in a swimming suit, and the suit and the tie are all photoshopped in. If you see me in a suit, folks, I will be horizontal. So we're going to talk about 3 things, and we're going to talk a bit about the supply chain crisis and how we got here. And honestly speaking, this is pretty important stuff because we think we may reveal some things that are new, but it also will show the extent and depth to which the problem is. It's not going to go away. There's a lot of folks, maybe some on this call, who think, well, you know, as soon as COVID dies down, it's going to all be back to normal. Never again. And we'll explain why. How bad it actually is and how that will impact your companies and what to do about it. Now, on the what to do about it, it's a 2-sided. One, kind of what you may want to do right away to help save yourself from some possible crises that will hit you. But secondly, there is actually going to be some tremendous opportunity, and I mean huge, for companies that are smart, savvy, and can take advantage of it to open up new markets. So we want to cover both sides. So I think we're going to start with these 2 issues, which are pretty important to frame the issue. And Dennis, you want to grab the China factory side?
I know from speaking with Sherwin and knowing about the IBG Global Group how sophisticated you all are. But I just thought for a minute we would say, when we talk about the supply chains, particularly in China, what it means. In the US terms, a factory is a place where you drive up to, you go to work and you leave. In China, David used to run a factory there of about 2,000 employees. It had 6 buildings. It had a main factory, obviously, to make respiratory masks. It had another building in the back, which was a place for recreation. There was a dormitory, and it wasn't like a Holiday Inn. It was like 4 or 5 levels of beds where people would sleep from time to time. There was a cafeteria, and it was essentially a small village. If you go to the Pearl River Delta, which is essentially 90 million people, I think it's about the 15th or 16th largest economy in the world. In southern China, you will see tens of thousands of factories like this. David ran one of those factories, and I think his insights will be important because what happened with COVID had an enormous impact upon these factories and, as a result, China. So Dave, why don't we go back to the beginning of the year and then sort of discuss how things went from there.
Sure. So the timing of Chinese New Year, as it turns out, was pretty important. when I ran my factories, as it has been going on for decades, a Chinese New Year, because that kind of is their big holiday. It's, Christmas, New Year's, Independence Day, or whatever holidays are celebrated throughout the EU. These holidays all come to Chinese New Year. It's the big one. Everybody goes home. In fact, my wife, who's Chinese, we celebrate something called the reunion dinner. Everyone comes back. So you have this enormous migration. And the way I kind of explain it for people in the United States, it's like everybody east of the Mississippi went to Los Angeles and everybody west went to Boston for a week and then went back. The migration is enormous. This year, the Chinese decided to lock down the country under quarantine right in the middle. Now, if they'd done it before the migration, well, you probably would have had people unhappy that they didn't go home, but they would have been locked away, wouldn't have gotten sick. If you'd done it afterwards, they would have brought the disease and spread it throughout China, which they did. The numbers coming out of China are absolutely not honest numbers. I'm sorry.
We don't agree with them, right, David?
No,
when
we
the
don't agree at all.
8,000 people died, that's absolutely can't be true.
Vastly understated. But at least the people would have been in the factories, and as they healed and got better, because most of the factory workers are pretty young folks and hardy, they would have gone back to work, back to normal, maybe after a month or so. Because they did the gigantic lockdown right in the middle, it not only locked people in their homes, but it locked them out of work, because these people commute hundreds, thousands of miles for the work. The factory workers that do the factory work on coastal China are normally from the center. So what you ended up with is this health crisis. They knew about it back in November. They let people from Wuhan spread throughout the country, and then people came into Wuhan. It just percolated, and we're talking like hundreds of millions of people moving around, trains, buses, cars, planes. So then you had all these people quarantined and locked down, but they were locked down for months. They couldn't get back to the factories. And that meant when even they had to start seeking alternate employment, it meant that they had to find a way to survive because they did not have unemployment compensation. There's no social safety net. And so what happened was a gigantic employment crisis. They started getting new jobs. They opened up things. They freelanced, but they didn't go back to those factories, which meant the factories were not filled and staffed with highly experienced, capable people when finally they did start to open up again. Dennis, you want to grab the...
Yeah, as David has told me, normally at his factory, 10% of the people after the holidays just never returned. They'd had enough money, they had family reasons, they didn't go back. But this year, from the information we've been told from in China, that between 40 and 60% of the workers did not return. Obviously, COVID was a big contributing factor. But as a result of that, instead of going out and having a factory where you have 90 out of 100 workers coming back, you ended up with maybe 50 workers coming back. And obviously, all workers do not perform the same jobs. And those of you who understand China, and I'm sure most of you do, China isn't anymore like making cheap plastic toys. I have grandchildren that go in a McDonald's Happy Meal as a giveaway. They're doing very sophisticated manufacturing. And when you lose someone who is a welder or works with precision tooling, replacing them is really hard. And so this is the problem that faced China and all of these manufacturers throughout China. And that led to a productivity and quality problem there. Dave, you want to pick up there?
Sure, because, Dennis is right. Dennis and I have been going to China for 33 years. I made my first trip 33 years ago, Dennis 35 years ago. And, the factories that we saw then, they don't even exist. They've already moved out. The ones that are there are doing pretty sophisticated manufacturing, understanding of technology and tolerances and measures and precision. These aren't people you can train up in 5 minutes. So all of a sudden you had all these workers that had to be replaced, and the people that would normally train them, some of them were locked out. So you finally go out, and I'm telling you, I know a lot of people in China. I work with dozens of factories there. They were literally on the street, all chasing the same people. You go down to Guangzhou, you got factories from horizon to horizon. They all needed replacement workers, so they took whatever they could get. But obviously, the new ones weren't going to be as fast, weren't going to be as good. Quality and output really suffered. And so now you've got skeletal crews making crappy parts that are trying desperately to get paid, because at this point in time, they've had months without paychecks. And Chinese factory liquidity, they don't have nearly the working capital access that we have in the EU or North America. They run out of cash real fast.
Maybe I
And they
can
need
just
to
add
ship.
here, David, for a second, that China basically has two kinds of companies. The SOEs, the state-owned enterprises like Sinopec, their energy company, or Sinochem, the chemicals. They're big. They essentially get all the money they need from either the government or the government tells the banks to loan the money. A lot of these companies, like the ones David used to work for, although it was owned by a foreign company, are owned by entrepreneurs, and they don't have the access to liquidity and money. And so they were actually in trouble beginning in December before the coronavirus hit. But then when the coronavirus went, instead of having the 10-day break for the holiday David talked about, 10 days became 2 weeks, became 3 weeks, became a month, and money was a real problem. I'm sorry to interrupt, Dave. Go ahead.
Yeah, so you're right. They were living kind of paycheck to paycheck. And then there's no paychecks for 2 or 3 months. But at that point, we started feeling in Europe and North America, we started feeling the pinch. Some products were short of supply. Some finished goods weren't on the shelves. Dennis and I were doing TV interviews in February saying, you're going to have empty shelves of consumer products, not because of panic buying, but because they aren't on the sea. They aren't in the sea containers. What that started to mean in the North American side and Europe is companies could not ship. They were reducing earnings, and that led to product shortages and some higher prices, and the stock markets really started to react. So these skeletal factories producing poor quality and low volumes, it started to hurt everybody around the world. And the Chinese that I worked with said, you know, it's been horrific, but what's going to really help us, now that we're back to work, you folks start buying. And then guess what? We all started to shut down. Certain places in Europe were hit really hard. Italy, Greece, others. Certainly North America, still a lot parts of it, the state I'm in, are still in pretty much lockdown. And so about the time that the paycheck to paycheck companies had all these problems we've already defined, they were desperate that we all start buying from them again. We all started shutting off our taps, going home, sheltering at home, weathering the storm, which meant their cash flow plunged off a cliff. And that became, for them, really kind of literally the last straw.
There's a point we want to make here that we'll make probably 3 or 4 times during the presentation. As bad as COVID-19 has been and the impact that it has, China has a lot of problems that are not generally recognized. Rising wages have over the years been forcing manufacturing out of China. It does have a debt crisis. If you look at their banks are severely undercapitalized. Now, they're backed up by the Chinese government. There are over several million empty houses throughout China that have been built, oftentimes in outside provinces that are underfinanced. Unemployment is a political, not just an economic issue in China. We don't have to tell you about the environmental crisis. In the US, we've been having terrible fires over the last couple of weeks on the West Coast. But any of you who've been to central China, like David and I've been, and maybe you have, the environmental crisis in there, in many cases, is worse. The political unrest, we can talk about Hong Kong, we can talk about the Uyghurs, and there are regional aggressive competitors. All of these things are essentially problems that have confronted China during the first quarter of 2020. And then back in 2018, President Trump, whether you like him or not, whether you approve or not, did impose tariffs on China, and they did affect these Chinese companies, because companies that were running on thin margins before were essentially squeezed down to almost nothing, and then they didn't have the capital. Let me turn it to you, Dave.
So Dennis is, boy, that he hits it right on the money. And the thing is, these things have been building for decades. You know, all of this builds up. So COVID wasn't like a storm to be weathered. COVID was the straw that literally broke the camel's back. And how hard did it break it? Well, there's a report by a blogger in April 2020. They only publish in Chinese. You have to kind of be an insider to get on their list. They said there's 247,000 bankruptcies January and February. And this is before COVID, before the rest of the world even knew much about it. And so we shared this data. A lot of people said, that's ridiculous, that's crazy. We did the numbers, and this is running around 10,000 times the rate of bankruptcy in North America. And then finally, South China Morning Post, very reputable, kind of the Wall Street Journal of Hong Kong, they came out and said in the first quarter, close on 500,000 companies closed. And new company registrations, you know, some of that creative destruction, the old dies and the new picks it up, that fell by 30%. So the combination of these two is literally catastrophic. We think at this stage, there's probably 1.25 to 1.5 million bankruptcies as of third quarter. New business startups are flat or down. And yes, to be fair, some of these might be mom and pop noodle shops and delivery services and whatever. That's true. But a large portion of these, based on the work that we have done hands-on, are industrial concerns, manufacturing, B2B, component suppliers, plastic suppliers, PCB boards. They could not weather all those crises we defined, and they are now padlocked and closed. That led to something unprecedented.
China started to grow significantly in 1976, and it essentially grew every year, every quarter since then until Q1 and Q2 of 2020. I have on the screen here, which you can read, I'm not going to repeat, you know, what levels of expansion were during 2019. But the contraction in Q1 was 9.8%. And interestingly, in the second quarter, you're going to say, well, Dennis, it's now September. What was the contraction in the second quarter? The answer is, I can't tell you, because for the first time in 40 some years, China decided they would stop reporting gross statistics. So we have no idea. Now, I would think if it contracted less than 9.8%, we would hear. But in any case, China this year will not grow for the first time since 1976. So their unabated economic growth is there. The reason is the broken supply chain, which is sort of why we're talking here this morning. David?
Yeah, it's a catastrophe, and let's all be very blunt here. If they're reporting 9.8, probably closer to 12 to 14. I mean, they fudged every number they could just to make it look this good, and then they said we're just not going to report. What this has meant, and there was a report out of Fox that for America alone, and I'm assuming, although I couldn't find documentation on this, but that over 5 years, $750 billion of exports are going to be taken out of China. And we're going to tell you where they're going to go, but they're not going to be in China anymore. The game is over. The tariffs, I think there's some general agreement that no matter who ends up winning the US presidency, the tariffs and the engagement with China will probably stay that way for a while. And all these other problems are piling on. So let's say that the EU has a similar kind of exodus. We're talking $1.5 trillion worth of products no longer to be manufactured. And in the short term, that's opportunity, but it sure is crisis, because if your factory is getting parts and components or finished goods from a factory that's already shuttered, and you know the tooling used to make your parts is gathering rust or dust, but you may not know it, and we're going to talk a bit about that, about how that's being camouflaged. There's a really serious problem. So what does it mean?
We hope at this point we've convinced you, or at least enticed you to believe that the supply chain is broken, because we'd like to move now to the second part of our presentation about what the heck does this mean for business, because the supply chain is, and by the way, if any of you do not think Fox Business News is a good way to look at the problem, the New York Times, which is clearly not Fox Business News, agrees to a large extent about the outbound loss and how these are. And so, we have more statistics for you, but let's move into the second part of this. What does this mean for business? David?
So finished goods are going to start disappearing. Certain ones already have. Components and subassemblies. And I'll tell you, I worked with a company in New Jersey a couple of weeks ago. They were making a sensor boxes for industrial fire suppression. They had 2,000 boxes sitting there. They bill out at 2,000 per box, and they were all sitting on the factory floor waiting for a box of 17-cent plastic unique parts that come out of China. And they said, well, we've been told 3 times that they're on the ocean, they're on the air, they're coming. And I said, guys, you consider the possibility they're not coming at all, ever. And because they keep getting requests for expediting fees. So it's going to mean, in ways small and large, things are going to start disappearing. And if those things are critical to your business, you've got to take some action. Some companies are just going to suffer. Some, if they really don't act quick enough, won't survive.
At this stage in the presentation, we want to impress on you 2 ideas. Number one is that no matter what you hear about coming out of China, we think you need to be pessimistic about what the Chinese can or will report to you, because we really don't believe from our anecdotal investigation that what you hear, oh, China's coming back, things are much better, that really is not the case. The second thing is that we believe we are probably at the beginning of the largest scale simultaneous realignment of supply chains in our lifetimes. Now, it isn't all going to happen today, and it's not going to happen tomorrow, but over the next 5 years, we really think that this realignment is going to have a major impact, not on American companies, but on German companies, Italian companies, South African companies. I know all of the members of the IBG group are all over the world. All of your countries, no matter where they are going to have the same general opportunities, and we think it's time to take advantage of it. So that's sort of what we'd like to talk about now. Dave?
And I'd like to give just one really brief anecdote on this first point, and then we're going to get into the second a little deeper. We had a client call us, and they said, look, we've been waiting on a couple C boxes of plastic parts. We really need them. And we got a call from our China manufacturer, and they said, oh, we were shut down for so long, and quality was not good, and we don't want to give you bad quality. We now have a 4-month backlog. So this was back in August. We won't be able to ship your parts till the end of the year. These are people that have already been waiting since February. And they said, but we'll do you a special favor. Normally you pay when the parts hit Long Beach. If you pay in advance, we'll move you to the front of the queue. Instead of shipping in November, December, or January, we're going to ship in September. Not a bad deal for a company desperate for components that are long overdue. And they said to me, what do you think? And I said, give me 1 day. Well, I didn't need a day. I needed about 7 hours, as it turns out. I called a friend of mine that I knew in China for 20 plus years. I said, here's an address. He said, what do you want me to do? I said, just go take a picture. And he did. He drove over and took a picture, and he sent it to me. And later that evening, I said, fellas, here's your factory. It's already locked. It's already closed. Nobody's at work. The lights are out. They're just running a scam to get a prepayment for something that they will never, ever produce. Your molds have probably already been sold for scrap metal. The sooner you come to grips with that, the more you're going to have a chance to get out of this. And so there's a lot of reasons that things are being manipulated now to try to get your cash. So with China, I don't know that we need to go over this in detail, and certainly you can have these slides, but the health crisis is worse than they say. There are parts of China even now that have gone back under quarantine. That COVID's having its second wave over there. Quality and volume production continues to be a problem. And raw materials are a problem because all the shipping stopped for 4+ months. If they needed raw materials from other parts of China or from overseas for some of their components, they couldn't get it. So
I
it's
do
still
work,
a
I
big
do
problem.
work, David, maybe I can just jump in. I do work for a number of metals trading companies around the world. And you have the LME and you have other places where in theory metals exist. There is a great dislocation in the ability to get the right metals to the right places. And when you look at the kind of metals that are being, this isn't the kind of thing you would put on an airliner. You'd have to ship in a 40-foot container. A lot of these raw materials simply are not getting to China. In some cases, not only because they don't exist, but they exist, but the ships are not moving as normally as they would. And to get them to certain places, there's essentially a logistical lockdown and making it very difficult. And the other thing is, didn't you have an example, David, of what it cost to put something on a 747 that's sort of interesting to throw in here?
Oh, goodness. So during the crisis, I was working with a number of U.S. buyers trying to get, protective personal gear, masks, shields, the nitrile gloves, all of that stuff in big demand. And so I found a supplier in China, then one in Malaysia, and these were being purchased by the government on a kind of a, desperation basis. And I said, well, so what's the stuff cost? Well, obviously, the masks had quadrupled and then went up tenfold. There's profiteering. But then once I secured the volume, the guy said, listen, by the way, if back in November of last year, you wanted to book a cargo 747, you wanted to book it, let's say, from Shanghai or Guangzhou to Los Angeles, could have got you one flight, full $250,000 or so, maybe, about that, maybe a little less, a little more. He said, now that same plane, $2.5 million. It's gone up. Why? Because, and it wasn't the shippers that did it, it was the very foresighted middlemen that said, hell, let's book all these planes. Let's just book them. And when COVID started, a few individual logistics companies just booked all the capacity. They didn't have anything to put in there, but they knew that they could sell it for a lot more later, and they did. So again, smart guys ahead of the curve making money. But now all that shipping expense has gone through the roof. So really, across the board, it's going to get a lot more difficult.
Okay, we've given you probably more anecdotes than you really care about, but there are hundreds more that we can give you. But the bottom line is supply chain in and out of China is very disrupted. We think it's going to be permanent. Now, that doesn't mean things won't be made in China and they won't be exported, but clearly a large percentage of what would have been made in China, you're just not going to be able to get to. So there are really two options that we'd like to talk about right now. One is either realigning your current supplies coming out of China or reshoring. And reshoring means, we'll get to that secondly, but the next slide will show you that greater diversification, three things you can do. If you're already manufacturing stuff in China now and you have one or two sources to supply, the least you should do is to go out and to find one or more reliable suppliers that you have hands-on relationship with who aren't going to promise you something that doesn't deliver. But beyond that, we think the real winners in the short run will be Southeast Asian countries, which for years have been competing with China, but nobody really wanted to go outside China because it was China and it was easier. But on the list that you'll see on the screen now to the left, there are 8 countries which we think will be the direct beneficiaries of realignment of stuff being made in China that's going to move there now. David, didn't you just do something with Malaysia?
Well, it's interesting. We spent a fair bit of 2018 and a lot of 2019 taking companies from China to Southeast Asia. Malaysia, we moved some manufacturing from China, some to Malaysia, some to Thailand, and right now we're doing a project for India. And these were started before COVID. All those other lists of reasons, debt, unemployment, costs rising, trade frictions. And by the way, again, whatever everyone's opinion is on the American presidency, there's a lot of divergent views on that. In fact, they're almost always extreme. But I will tell you, if Trump could somehow enable the people in Malaysia and Thailand to vote for him, he'd win in a landslide, because they and a lot of other Southeast Asia people think that it was the tariffs that kind of were the last straw that broke the camel's back of the China dominance of manufacturing. So these countries are benefiting, and they've been prepping for years. They're ready. So these countries are capable. They do have capacity constraints, however, but some of the product that some of you on the call may have been receiving from China, maybe you're still getting it, but you're thinking maybe I ought to have more than one source so that if something happens again, COVID-20 or something like this, some follow on, you can get product from somewhere else and not be tied. And if the trade frictions get worse and there starts to be a lot of issues, you have opportunity. And Latin America.
One other related thing I might mention here is that the Trump administration, again, renegotiated what was called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. It's now called the USMCA, which has been adopted by Canada, Mexico, and the United States. So there are great benefits essentially for moving products even better than before between Mexico and the United States and Canada, and back and forth. And so that has nothing to do with the COVID-19 crisis, but with the pressure to realign where you want to diversify. The USMCA for Latin America and Mexico particularly has been extremely important. And I would expect a lot of the realignment to be looking at that area. Dave?
Quite agreed. So the other alternative, the North America term is reshoring, since for us, moving product out of country is going offshore. I'm sure there's another name for it elsewhere, but I'm going to use this generic name. Basically, bring it back to your home country. And there are really strong trends on this. National self-interest. I think many nations were really caught flat-footed by COVID, and they realized, we are very sophisticated manufacturers. Ventilators is a prime example. Many EU countries, Latin American countries, North America, we couldn't get ventilators because they're made in China. Yet that technology evolved from these companies. That was designed there. Great global medical device companies had pushed all their manufacturing offshore. So there's self-interest on critical things, government policy, tax and incentive. And with even before COVID, employment of high-paying, good-paying manufacturing jobs was always a desire. Now, with the unemployment rate going higher because of the shutdown, there's even more concern about this. All of these factors, and we don't have to plow through them, obsessively, but there is a lot of incentive now for bringing it all back, or some of it. And the one last thing I would mention here, obviously it's going to be more expensive if you bring it back to Germany or Spain or UK, or you bring it back to Canada or Mexico, whatever, wherever you're bringing it back from. You probably went to China because it was cheaper. Now it isn't cheaper and may not be accessible at all. But even the Wall Street side of things and the financiers are kind of getting their eyes really open to supply chain risk. Dennis and I have looked at this very carefully, and again, we've been working together for 30 plus years. A lot of what drove a lot of the China massive expansion was obviously low cost. And a lot of that was driven by corporate policy of maximizing EBITDA. I think this really was popularized by Jack Welch during his GE days, where basically EBITDA and the finance side was the king. Whatever they wanted, they got. And the purchasing function was more of a get the price down. And that argued for consolidation, sending it all to one supplier to maximize your value and reduce the price. But it created risk, and risk that has been largely unrecognized till now, that these supply chains with single sources were damn fragile. If you're making a part, or you're making a device in Italy, and you've got 10-15% of the components from home country, but the rest are scattered in single purchase relationships all over the globe, any fracturing of that supply chain stops everything. So now, recently, we have some members of our team that are very involved in the venture community, very plugged into Wall Street. They say that the new thing is when venture evaluates or private equity evaluates a deal, it isn't just how soon can you get the revenue, how soon can you get the EBITDA, how soon can we flip this baby? It's also, have you put money in for supply chain risk premium? And we'll accept the slightly lower EBITDA with more safety of our money. So reshoring, bringing it back, a lot of reasons that are driving the value, but it also means that in certain things, price has become somewhat less important because they realized that to maximize price reduction, they created risk. And I think that's really important to know.
What we've been doing for the last 30 or 40 minutes is talking to you the big problem, how it happened in China. Secondly, how do you protect yourself immediately in the short run from what we see as a long-term problem? Finally, in the next 15 or 20 minutes before we take your questions, we'd like to talk a little bit to you about new markets, about where there are opportunities that you really may not have been thinking about. I'm a grandfather, and I was on vacation with two of my grandsons recently, and my daughter and son-in-law. And my 6-year-old grandson has a big head. I don't know, he got a big head. And so he has a bike, and his old helmet wouldn't work. So I went down to the biggest bicycle store in southern New Jersey. We were on a vacation, sort of self-isolating in a house, and we had a good time. I went to the bike store and said, this kid needs a new helmet. They looked at me and they said, we only have one helmet. I said, what do you mean? Well, you mean one style? They said, we only have one helmet. This is the Jersey Shore in the middle of the summer. They said, all of our other helmets are gone. By the way, we're not renting out any more bicycles. And if a bicycle breaks, we can't fix it because there are no parts. 2 guesses. Where do you think helmets, bicycles, and bicycle parts are made? Yes, you only need one. It's China. And so that's one example of a market you never really would have thought about. And yet there it is, it hits you in the face. Now, in a minute, we're going to talk about serious new markets for manufacturing. But we think as you look around the world at your own particular countries where, you IBG global members are, you're going to see similar things pop up. And this is where I think with a little bit of creativity, you can go out and essentially locate those things and then talk about how you can work with your local companies in that area. And so, David, why don't we talk a little bit about new markets with an industry focus after COVID-19?
Absolutely. So we've been preaching the mantra for some months now: protect yourself, be savvy, re-examine your supply chains, be critical, and get out there and find replacements. But that's kind of a defensive negative position. But Dennis and I have also observed as we've worked with companies that any crisis creates opportunity. There's an old saying about in North America, we had this gigantic market crash back in 1929, and some very thoughtful economist said that when there's blood in the streets, there's gold to be picked up as well. And so I think that in this really tumultuous time, the things that are not going to be done in China for various reasons, these create niches, places you can go. Now, we're not going to give you a general, how to market your products internationally. Gosh, you all know that.
They're
lots
all
of people
experts,
know that.
David. We can't tell these people anything they don't know for their whole careers, right?
But we are going to point out some unique things about the COVID opportunity. So starting with, what are the kind of things that we think are going to be really impacted? This is just a small list, but it's a start. Manufacturing already. Energy grid components. I work with 3 companies involved in energy grid components. Every one of them is having China-based shortages. All of these things, again, we're not going to walk through them one by one, but there are many, many things that have been impacted in China. And once that stuff moves away, it's not going to come back. Now, again, some of this will most likely slide down to Cambodia and Vietnam. Some may go to India. On the other hand, talking about the importance now of mitigating risk from the financial markets, some of these will be a very good play for those of you on the call to sell to people across the street. People across the street that may have always been buying from China, and maybe you didn't pursue those aggressively, or you have the capacity to make these things. I'll tell you right now, in North America, certainly in the area where we live, there's a big renaissance in medical device manufacture. It's always been a strong medical device design area, but the manufacturing got pushed offshore. And now companies are springing up here saying, I'm manufacturing, safety equipment, I'm manufacturing other things, If I'm doing box builds and circuit boards, I think I can make small ventilators. I think I can make blood transfer devices. So these are places to start thinking about.
Before we move off that slide, one thing about tool and die, David, because I think it's important. If you're going to have a part that you make, there are only so many tool and die manufacturers globally. There are a lot of them in China now. You might want to look at this area, because if you went to a tool and die person and said, how much does it cost to make this part? They'll say, oh, it'll take, it'll be $40,000 and I can make it in 6 weeks. What we found in the US is, yeah, we can make it in 6 weeks, but the 6 weeks starts a year from now, because there's enormous amount of demand for limited numbers of tool and die shops. And so these are the kind of, things that even when you know what you want and you got somebody to buy it, you have to get in line. So go ahead, Dave. I think that was important to add.
So we have a couple process recommendations on the domestic side. So this is within your nation, within your nation state. Think about who's leaving China. Think about those that were buying from China and now can't buy or won't buy or have pressure not to buy. Or there are companies in China just went belly up and they don't want to take the risk again. Try to see, are they targets for you to sell your services, skills to? Critical supplies with national interest. I know several companies in North America that are actively transitioning their factories for the PPE. One of the most notable is hand sanitizer, which now a lot of distilleries in North America have transitioned to that. The benefit of that is my hand sanitizer now smells like vodka. So I've got a plus on both sides. But there are ways to look at national interests and say they want to bring it home because they don't want to be at risk of this again. What can you do to get in there and utilize your facilities? Government contracting the same. They're increasingly wanting to keep it in country. And last, and I think this is really important, we're used to very much competing on price with quality, flexibility as a given. Kind of like that's the ticket to get in, but then price had to be low. I think price is actually going to be less important because people are willing to pay more. Consumers, if they think it's homegrown, certainly true in North America. And as long as the quality and flexibility, speed, the having low inventories instead of having to buy C boxes at a time, you can deliver in smaller quantities. That's a positive on working capital cash flow. So I think that the domestic method is look who's leaving China, look who it is that has a critical national interest, and is there a government contract that would have a reason to want to bring it home? And finally, your calling card doesn't have to start with we're the cheapest. I think that these really and know there are companies on this call that can look in their domestic markets and find opportunity here if your facility obviously has the wherewithal to transition. When you go international, all of these apply, but there's a few twists. And Dennis, I'm going to let you jump on this one.
For years, I've done FDI for companies in and out of the United States. And my experience has changed recently with COVID essentially destroying the ability to travel internationally, to send your salespeople there, to send people there. It used to be that, if you had the adequate capital, you'd do a brownfield or a greenfield, you'd do direct investment, and that's how you'd set up in another country. What I think COVID has done here is it said to you, if you want and need to get into another country, partnering, joint venturing, which in the past was something you really didn't try to do because you didn't have as much control, I think it's going to be much more significant for you, at least in the short run. Now, 2 years from now, if we all have been inoculated and we have vaccines and everything goes back to normal, might be true. But I think never before has it been more important to have local contacts in a country where you can essentially form a joint venture to create this new normal while we go through the COVID crisis. And because IBG is already set up globally around the world, my suggestion is, I guess you've already thought of it, but if you haven't, go to your partner in India or in South Africa or Germany and say, how do we two work together to make sure that this domestic need here is going to be met over there? And I think that's something that a lot of people have not thought about yet, but I think is really important. And David, the next thing I think you wanted to say is the challenges to global firms. You want to pick up on that?
Yeah, so IBG is a tremendous resource because you're already networked in and you've got great people to help with that connectivity. The challenges on the global firms of now starting to do this outreach: partner selection, critical; strategy, alignment. I mean, we see all the time in Dennis and I, our business, they partner up with like the biggest and the best. Like, we got the greatest partner, except that strategy doesn't necessarily account for you. And we always say, you want to get a partner that's a little further down the food chain, where they're hungry to promote your products in their country, not necessarily the top ones, because now you're just an add-on. You're not critical to their success. Understanding the regulatory environments, and as always, culture is more and more important. And as Dennis points out, he and I mean, we're both, members of the 5-7 million mile club. I mean, I passed my 5 million air flight miles years ago, but that's when it was easy to get there and do some immersion, get to understand and learn the local culture. You could be a part of it, never in it, but learn of it. Now you have to rely on your partners because you're not going to be able to travel as much, and people may be reluctant to meet with you. And I think this entire attitude, like, how many of us didn't do any Zoom calls a year ago? Maybe we used video Skype now and again. I'm doing 6 of these a day. This is my life. And it's never going to go all the way back. And particularly when people realize they could save a lot of money on those business class seats and hotels and taxis by doing this. That means that the selection of partners and the ability to have somebody that really represents you well is critical, because you can't go there yourself easily. You can't self-correct, and your learning of the culture has to come through this medium. It's a new world, and we have to embrace that. And I think these challenges are important.
David, I see Sherwin on there, and I'm hoping there are a few questions, but we had one final slide that we'll just throw up on the screen because we think it's important. And it's that, like democracy, this is going to be a messy time. Time is of the essence. Capacity, your capacity and everybody's capacity is not limited. And the most important thing is to do risk analysis and prioritization of what's important to you and your clients. We could talk longer, but Sherwin, if you'll nod your head yes or no, if there are some questions, we would love to take them now.
Yeah, we do have a question. Yeah, we do have a question from the group. One of our viewers asked, what about China as a market? For example, German car manufacturers who are now selling in there, where can they go?
I can hazard an answer on that. Certainly, as a guy that's been going to China for 30 years and lived there for a long time, and was making 7 trips a year just a couple of years back, it was astonishing, the dominance of luxury automobiles, particularly German automobiles. I think that the bad news, it's going to be severely curtailed, because the economy in general, you're still going to have a big swath of very wealthy people who want the best. That's going to be true everywhere. I mean, I'm sure they still sell some top-end Mercedes product in Somalia. Not a lot. It's that second tier that used to aspire and afford. I think they're going to be really curtailing. And so I think that a rational plan on that has to be a little cautious and pull back. I think it's also reasonable to start, again, focusing more on that aggressive marketing within places that are closer. I think that folks like Mercedes, who, by the way, I worked for 8 years, they may find that their growth is now going to come from a recovering EU, a recovering North America, economies that will start to pick up, particularly as those high quality manufacturing jobs get brought home, wages will rise. I mean, actually, it's optimistic good news in some ways that the smashing of the China stranglehold It's going to cause prices to rise, but it's going to cause wages to rise as well. And that means people are going to want to aspire here where they may have been on a downtrend. But I do not think that the super roaring, and I'll go further, it'll be the same for Rolex watches. It's going to be the same for Versace. A lot of stuff that was just roaring in a country that had massive growth for 30, 35 years, people are going to suddenly realize spending all that cash on discretionary items, non-essential, it's going to be hard to continue. It's my opinion.
Here's my quick spin. China will probably exceed the size of the U.S. economy within the next 6 to 7 years if things don't change. So it will be the largest economy in the world. China will not disappear. China is not going to go out of business. But the level at which they are growing, I think we've documented well. And as David said a few minutes ago, where the Chinese government is going to allow the money to go is, I think, going to change. And so don't ignore China. Yes, there will still be cars being sold there, but we think the opportunities as the world changes are essentially going to be refocused.
Okay,
Yeah, I don't want to give the impression that nobody's going to buy a Mercedes. There will still be a lot, but I do think that it's not going to be a growth market and maybe shrink slightly.
Yeah, I want to watch the clock carefully, but we do have another question. And the question is, both of you, as having been in China for the last 35 years so often, how well do you think the Chinese leadership understands the presentation you made today? Do they understand it and are just trying to deal with it, or do they really not understand it fully at all, in your opinion?
David?
Well, there's a lot of levels to that
You
question.
haven't been called by Xi Jinping, have you? I haven't, but go ahead. I'd like to hear your opinion.
That's a really good question. I'm going to answer it on a couple quick levels, and Dennis, I'd like your take. I do think that internally, they collect a lot of data, a lot of demographics. I think they probably do at some level understand it. That said, understanding the problem does not mean they understand the solution. You know, the old saying that they used to have about Japan, you know, the nail that sticks up gets pounded down, and carpenter's solution to every problem is a hammer. Well, they've had a solution for 44 years, which is we make the rules and we've given you prosperity by dominance of their local economy. And I think it's actually a big problem for them, because when you've only got a one-party system, you know, I mean, here in America, if it's good news, everybody takes credit. If it's bad news, everybody blames the other side. This way throughout the world. They've had chest thumping on behalf of the Communist Party for 44 years that we've delivered all these goods to you. And now it's come to a stop. The train has halted and it's going backwards. And for a while, it's going to be blame the rest of the world and blame Trump and blame. But ultimately, the people in China are going to get a little tired of that. Because keep in mind, every single person that's alive under 50 in their professional living existence has known 8 to 12% growth every single year. I mean, they're not prepared for this. So I think they understand it. I don't think they're telling the world the truth about it, but I honestly don't think they know what to do about it, because the last time they faced an economic crisis, recession, figuring out what to do, Mao was still breathing. And I think that they're really sitting around like, what the hell do we do? I mean, and I that's my answer. I think they understand the problem, but I don't think they actually have any clue as to a good solution. And my guess is they're going to double down on blame and control and try to get their people into a wartime mentality of we're beleaguered, we're the Chinese, and they're attacking us. That's my guess. I hope it doesn't happen, by the way, but that would be where I think it goes.
Okay, this is a good segue. We have a comment in the chat box, which I'm just going to share with you and everybody else. One of our listeners from India said, great event, kudos to David and Dennis, and very happy to be on the call today. So let me just wind up with that and say, certainly, we at IBG Global very much appreciate the fact that the two of you spent an hour with us today and covered a topic which, at least in my experience, very few people understand at the level of depth that you presented. And to our participants, we will provide you with a link to the video recording of this. And David and Dennis, if you'll send me the presentation, we can send that out as well to those who are online. I will also include with that your contact information in case they want to contact you and have any more information or perhaps get involved with you in the future. They'll know how to do that as well. In terms of our program, I can tell you that in 2 weeks from now, we will have our next event, Tuesday, September 29th, as you see on the screen. Our IBG Global Associates in France, Canada, and Saudi Arabia will be addressing the topic of what does the worldwide economic power shift mean for international business. Those of you that are on the line today will get a reminder about that. We'd be very happy if you signed up, and I'm convinced that it'll be an interesting session, which again will provide you with information on a dialogue basis that you might not get anywhere else. So again, with gratitude to Dennis and David for being with us tonight, and to our audience for staying with us. I always watch whether we had people leave the call in the middle. Actually, in this program, we had people come in who weren't there at the beginning, and seemingly everybody else stayed with us. So again, my thanks to those of you on the line. We look forward to having you in additional events, and the IBG Global Network is here to assist you as you move forward in building your own market strategies. So thanks to all.
Thank you, Sherwin. We appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Sherwin. Thanks to everybody that was here today. It was a pleasure.
Sure, our pleasure. And those of you in Pittsburgh, and David and Dennis in the Pittsburgh area, have a great day, what's left of it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.